titled Stop Botting My Baby. It's about tactically protecting a streaming platform from malicious automation and botting. My name is Randy Gingeleski, and if you're joining us live at 9 a.m. Eastern on a Sunday morning, then I really appreciate you. Brief slide about me. I'm an application security engineer for Warner Media, sitting on our direct-to-consumer team, and therefore responsible for HBO Max. We'll cover what that is on the next slide. Working on the launch of that recently forms the basis of this talk, should you be wondering if you're in the right place. We're going to discuss application threats that popped up at launch, specifically what seems to be the state-of-the-art for malicious automation, and go over what you're working against should you be writing your own bots of any kind. Earlier in life, I worked for a couple security consulting shops, mostly pen testing and different from my current work. The word consulting can be kind of a fluffy term, but that experience was worthwhile to see a variety of security programs at different places and different maturities. This talk's title, Stop Botting My Baby, derives from a phrase I'd hear in consulting, which equated our work to going into different software shops and calling their babies ugly. It's funny when you first hear it, but not something you understand until you're no longer a security mercenary and now you're an in-house person. Get sensitive about your own brand and your own apps. They do become your baby to protect from the harsh world of computer attacks and Reddit comments and whatever. Also spent some time on the offensive side of botting, not super recently, but if there's a website where you can play flash games against people for money, that's probably a place I've been banned from. In another life, I was a full-time programmer after studying at St. John's University, notable as the intended physical home of Hope 2020. Looking forward to maybe Hope 2022 there. And you can find me around the internet by just my last name. However, I'm not a fan of social media. You can find me on like GitHub. Anyway, without further ado, we'll get started. Working on HBO Max every day, I have an abnormal level of intimacy with the platform, but friends and family still ask me, what is HBO Max? And understandably, there's been some public confusion. The short answer is to say we're a streaming service, not unlike other big names in this space, such as faithlifetv.com or Mubi. Better answer is that HBO Max is a gateway to all of the content under Warner Media. That's a media organization that includes Warner Brothers, Turner, plus its brands like TNT, and then CNN, Crunchyroll, HBO, Cinemax. It's amazing how much content that really is, from Turner classic movies to Game of Thrones to impending Justice League Snyder Cut. We probably all know HBO, the original brand, and because that stands for home box office, it makes sense to me why that's the namesake of our direct-to-consumer offering. And notably, it's a recent offer. We launched on May 27th of this year, which was a week after I joined the team. I had never worked a big public launch like this. Felt way different from pen testing, banks, or utilities. Since AT&T ultimately owns Warner Media, and they've been very public about how HBO Max is a major investment for them, there was a lot of pressure on the launch. There's certainly upside to AT&T's investment, like kind of a well-funded startup-y environment, but for launch it created a lot of pressure. Before getting into specifics or war stories, it seems helpful to do a rough threat model and ask that question of who might attack us. We'll scope this into just HBO Max, the application. As a wider company, we might be subject to more sophisticated or well-funded threats, like the hypothetically state-sponsored Sony Pictures hack in 2014. But for HBO Max, we can imagine our threats to be motivated mainly by money. And our main threat is credential stuffers, people that are generally attacking our login. It costs $14.99 per month to subscribe directly with us. There are many folks who get access for free, like through AT&T plan, but that direct monthly cost is something we were criticized for being high relative to competitors. So if you make your living doing sketchy computer stuff and can identify valid credentials for something worth almost $15 a month, that's an easy sell for a couple dollars at least. You can sell those on various forums, or be really enterprising and just set up an automatic shop yourself. Naturally, these actors aren't going to try typing in different credential sets all day by hand, so it makes a lot of sense to come and bot us. And as a new streaming service, there's a bigger, or at least fresher, target on our backs than our competitors. Separate but related to credential stuffing would be automation that targets like a gift card endpoint or something where a string correlates to stored value. That doesn't exist in the scope of HBO Max, the application. As a wider organization, we had legacy functionality that may have been acceptable for Max within a certain time frame, but I'll ignore that for the sake of our discussion. Plus, if you generate gift cards the right way, there should be a pretty high computational difficulty compared to just running some already breached credentials. Also, for the sake of completeness, it seems that somebody could try to take down HBO Max just to hurt AT&T's overall stock. You could short it and profit off a predictable sink in price. However, this would suggest some critical vulnerability in the app, or more related to cloud security, which would put it out of scope. As you might expect, there were many different sets of eyes that looked at our application before launch. There's also a change freeze in effect leading right up to it. Pretty standard things that you'd expect. And therefore, we felt good that there weren't any literal showstopper vulns. Another big threat, maybe less obvious, is just pure traffic volume from normal users. We ran a beta offering that started fourth quarter of 2019, but the number of users that participated in that would pale in comparison to those expected for launch and that actually showed up for launch. So if that was going to be an issue, it wouldn't be one that my AppSec team could respond to per se. And separate teams within Warner Media carried out a lot of load testing. So we didn't anticipate that being an issue based on those results, and it wasn't. Finally, there's a possible sliver of logically motivated threats that might want to disrupt HBO Max for non-financial reasons. Somebody might not care for our signature content, which can be political in nature, like John Oliver's show. We're also associated with CNN and serve some CNN content, so you can use your imagination as to that pool of threat actors. So with our threat landscape in mind, we'll kind of take stock of what we're protecting here, also what we're available. And though we have great relationships with our vendors, I don't want to pigeonhole this talk to specific vendors or tools, so I'm going to talk abstractly. As you might imagine, in 2020, HBO Max is cloud-based. Our application is written using contemporary paradigms like containers and a scalable mean. managing those containers. Have a totally separate front end and back end where the client utilizes a popular JavaScript framework and the back end is a RESTful API. Ultimately, our API is not monolithic. It does call upon numerous services. Content tends to live on a dedicated content delivery network, a CDN, and that keeps latency at bay. All these leading practices yielded some assurance pre-launch that our app would go down from normal user volume alone. As mentioned earlier, too, we just did a lot of load testing. Very sensitive about handling a massive traffic. Didn't want any downtime or sluggishness during launch week or, well, ever. So anyway, we have a web application firewall in front of HBO Max. Generic examples of products in that space include Cloudflare, My, AWS WAF, and Imperva. We also have all sorts of logging and monitoring that occurs once you're past the perimeter. And we have tools to search over and visualize all of that data that's been recorded. Examples of products in the space include Splunk, Exabeam, Datadog, Kibana, and Grafana. And then for reasons including and beyond security, we have telemetry and detection of various types in our application's front end. This can be helpful for anti-automation efforts, and there are a bunch of dedicated bot detector products like Google reCAPTCHA, White Ops application integrity, Akamai as a bot management thing, Perimeter X bot defender. There's also related just performance monitoring as offered by New Relic Browser, LogRocket, or Beacon. So a lot of tools. We have a lot of tools, as you might expect of an enterprise. For your own projects, there are open source takes on a lot of this stuff. Like you might stand up mod security as a web application firewall. I see the tactics we use being just as effective without the fancy price tags, but your mileage may vary. After thinking about our threats, we thought through this modern cloud-based tech stack. We've acquired some tools. We can take a closer look at the moving parts of HBO Max and what's going on in the normal user path. If you come unauthenticated to our web app, you'll basically end up taking one of two paths. One, you might create a new account, usually also passing us your credit card information, or two, you log in. That could be with a native HBO Max account or through some other provider like a traditional TV service. Before doing either of those paths, though, you might browse around our content or our help articles, but ultimately you're going to be pushed to do one of those two things. Or, of course, you might even go to a torrent site. That's outside the scope of my job. So those user paths boil down into just 3 API calls. There's this /API/login, same thing, /account, and then /payment/methods. Login and account, the first two, are just on one service. Payment methods is actually on another. And as is common to do now, we have constant monitoring of our response code ratios from those services, or you might just call that our error rate. By far, we're either seeing statuses that are 200 something for good or 400 something for bad, for errors either related to the format of your request or the actual card information, like a payment decline. So this error rate is a quick way to find out if there's something going on, usually something that's louder in nature. Then, of course, just beyond that sort of ratio barometer, there's detailed logging taking place. But if you're under attack, it's harder to dig into that quickly. And I think anyone who's acted as an analyst with an enterprise log searching program can probably empathize with that. That perhaps those machines are never given enough power to give you things quickly. Something else to keep in mind is that even though consumers might spend more time with our platform than, say, online banking, the session management is much more liberal. People don't need to log in as much, which means there's less logging of them logging in. And that can kind of, I guess, probably make the way that we respond to things be different than, one of those other types of sites that could be under attack. So, launch week logistics. Logistics-wise, we launched on Wednesday, May 27th, Eastern Time. All of our apps became available in various app stores early that morning. The web app was opened more widely than beta. That was really the only switch that flipped there. For my team, we had a rotating schedule that would ensure throughout the first week post-launch that there was a human operator that was manning the trenches, so to speak. And then all the other supporting teams had something similar in place. Everybody around HBO Max. Also, some of our vendors have their own stocks, so we'd be in persistent chat rooms with their people, and then whoever else wanted or needed to be in the security room. So basically, everybody was at peak vigilance. What were we looking at during launch week? Really, we're looking at all those tools described before, and I'll break down in more detail what that was. So you might start off, you've got your client-based telemetry, detecting some bots and keeping them away. That's not an entirely perfect science, and I see it as a cat and mouse game. Not that most of this stuff isn't. But if you've got a product in place along the lines of Google reCAPTCHA, it's just not going to be a silver bullet for every type of malicious automation. So you're also paying attention to things like error rates for individual services or endpoints. As pointed out before, /API/login was our big endpoint, and is our big endpoint, and it's also part of a larger service too. It's not just by itself. One trick we saw during launch week is someone would come, and for every time they hit /API/login, they'd also hit this other endpoint on the same service, and it's not hard to discern they're part of the same service since they're just at a single host. And this other endpoint is one that'll return you a 200 status code virtually all the time. You can kind of work out the rest for yourself. The idea being that our error rate alarms won't go off if they're service-wide or host-wide, because even if every single request from the login endpoint is sending back a 400-something status, you're getting status from the alternate endpoint. So that enables you as an attacker now to keep control over the ratio of requests coming back and therefore the error rate, and thus not trip the alarms that we have. So yeah, this seems kind of smart. When we saw this behavior, they were just slamming us with traffic too. So even if we were limited to host-wide error rate visualization and nothing else, nothing more specific, we'd have seen something was up just by the count of requests. I guess over a long period of time, you're looking at these tools and kind of staring into the abyss. Very normal patterns emerge in the traffic for certain times of days, for certain days of the week. Basically, it comes out in these waves. So if you throw that off with enough requests during any given time, especially at a slow time of day, then that's just going to be obvious even if you are not affecting the error rate in any way. So beyond that, what do you do if you sense something like that? Let's say an attacker is fairly successfully testing a ton of credential sets on you. Other measures have thus far failed. The in-client bot prevention has failed for whatever reason. In that case, you start looking for a common thread. Some of these attributes that can be threads, as I'll call them, hadn't even occurred to me before getting into this position. As alluded to before, I've written some scrapers and some bots and unofficial APIs myself in the past, but probably not for any sites that have invested as much in security as perhaps Warner Media has. The obvious common attributes for an attacker might be broken out like this: where they come from, what they look like, how they behave. Indeed, this is how you might get identified as a single actor or a probable single actor, and then subsequently blocked. Because if you can identify these common threads with any modern WAF, you can block somebody on it. Mainly, this is stuff that's noticeable from the perimeter, given blocking at the perimeter is straightforward. If you find common threads that aren't obvious unless you get into that internal logging, that's going to be a lot more complicated to put a stop to. And you can really stare into this with your log ingestion tools if you're up to it. So first, where does an attacker come from? Probably the most basic thing under this category is identifying someone by an IP address. You might see an attack that sends millions of requests from a single IP over a relatively short time frame, like a couple hours. Of course, I guess it's relative to the amount of traffic that your application gets, but most of the time that's going to be obvious and unusual. So you might say, we'll just block IP address, that's easy. But that tends to unfold in a whack-a-mole like pattern, where someone's programmed their script in such a way that upon detecting a block, which is usually obvious, you'll start getting like 403s, or requests will just start timing out or being really weird. Then your script will just switch to another IP, and that's easy on any modern cloud thing. Thus, the people manning the perimeter, we might start looking at a wider swath of network, either subnets or ASNs, which are autonomous system numbers. If you're unfamiliar with those, basically an ASN is assigned by the various powers that be to like an internet service provider, a hosting provider, or server co-location place. Basically, any place that has a lot of network traffic is eventually going to get an ASN. And then the ASN is separate and oftentimes more useful than going by some subnet that you derive from a bunch of IPs you sample. Usually the ASN is just going to be more helpful and is wider. And then I guess for both of those, especially for ASNs, you can go searching to find out how to look those up yourself. There's tons of tools out there. You give an IP address, they'll give you the ASN. I think it's also just part of normal WHOAMI. For smaller sites, like if you're running your own forum software, there are also public block lists out there, which will more or less ensure no hosting providers or colos, ASNs can send traffic to your site. But an enterprise operation isn't likely to be that liberal with big indefinite term network blocks like that. Depending on your target audience, even indefinite term IP blocks may make people hesitant, because in the case of some consumer facing thing, maybe once an attacker does a DHCP release, somebody else could be blocked that's a legit person. And that's why with a lot of these WAF products and different places you can install rate limits, you'll see that a lot of them are actually short-term bans. So you find a naughty IP address, and then there's a rolling block of like 10 minutes at a time until that behavior subsides. Then what does an attacker look like, at least in terms of their traffic that analysts look at? These attributes kind of transcend network origins, but might also be shared by a big pool of legitimate users too. So there's that risk level as well. Probably one of the easiest things to see at the perimeter is just request headers. User agent strikes me as one of the most generally significant. And then, of course, you might have other headers that are proprietary to your app. You might not realize that a whole bunch of things on incoming requests can be used as sort of a computed fingerprint. This might be called TLS hash. It might be called device identifier. That's kind of a closed box system, but my understanding is you have all these things taken into consideration. You have all the request headers. You have different ways that the TLS handshake is happening. All these things are computed by your product, and they try to come up with a unique identifier for each user. And the degree of success on that seems to vary. And I guess you could write your own thing like this into a mobile app, but it seems more common to be computed by a product like a WAF that does a bunch of magic and then spits out this hash. And this is just an interesting data point because, like with a streaming application, you might find that all instances of a specific device, like a certain streaming stick, have the same hash. But in other cases, the hash can be unique to a specific malicious automation script or to a Docker container. So if you blew the container away and stood up the same script, maybe it's some basic intentional other differences, then you'd end up with a new hash. Overall, these types of identifier hash things are probably one of the harder elements to anticipate as a bot writer. Then lastly, how does an attacker behave? Again, this is based on their traffic that analysts are seeing, very perimeter based. This might include what paths they're requesting, in what order, how much time there is between requests. And then for things like a login endpoint or any kind of challenge endpoint where there's not a fixed set of inputs per se, the security team is going to get an idea of what's unusual and what's not. Like, you can imagine we see people who seem to guess their password wrong 9 times, pretty quick succession, and then they finally get it on their 10th try. That's still 10% success rate for a single IP, and seems like pretty generous to begin with. So if you're below, say that 10% success rate, that's pretty suspicious. And then maybe we're not talking one IP. Maybe this is like a cross analysis of a whole ASN with a specific fingerprint. If the path you're requesting is just heavily skewed towards login, if that's especially all you're hitting, or in this obvious like 50-50 split between login and some 200 yielding endpoint, I can go and guess that you're one coordinated attacker. And that also gives me grounds to block you. For a streaming experience like HBO Max, as you can imagine, we're not just taking login credentials and payment methods. Like, after people authenticate, we have a whole content service. And a lot of stuff comes from a bona fide CDN, but there's also metadata that's requested around that content that we can easily see from the perimeter. And there are some other normal tells from the perimeter too. So if you're just hitting our services that do login, that do payment methods, and then you never request anything that's related to content, like you never interact with that after logging in, that's pretty unusual. Then I guess on top of all this stuff, regarding how you behave, there's even more information available from in-client telemetry, should you have it. Often it's not feasible to correlate that with these more perimeter-friendly data points, at least in a timely manner when responding to anything. But if you're hitting somebody long enough, they can dig it up and use it against you. The front-end telemetry and bot detection varies from product to product. As mentioned before, that's a closed magic box. But my understanding is even if you've got some scripted headless browser-based stuff and you think it's convincing, it's still going to lack the uniqueness of real user encounters. And even if you're defining some randomness in like how the cursor moves around or times between things, over a long enough period of time and a big enough sample size, even some defined randomness from a script can become apparent. And we'll talk more about that later. So on my shift, I guess here's my personal war story, tying everything together that we've seen thus far. My shift was towards the end of that first week, so I'd been in our persistent conference calls a bunch since launch. But it's different when you're the one person responsible on your shift as the point person. And just the way our schedule fell, I had to take over at like 2 a.m. Eastern and be on shift until 2 p.m., which really like wasn't too bad. You just wake up super early, you take your stimulants of choice and get your dashboards going. And then you might be alone until like 8 or 9 a.m. when other people start hopping on. And at that point, we'd instituted a bunch of active blocks on types of things we've mentioned so far. So we had a bunch of blocks in place since launch. Also had a collaborative document of other potential blocks. And you'd investigate across the tools and you'd make a case in this document for why certain criteria pointed to an attacker and blocking them would yield minimal risk to genuine users. So we had all that background, and early in my shift at like 3 or 4 in the morning, we were getting a lot of unnaturally behaving traffic from what seemed to be hosting services, particularly switching between two services, and you could just spot that in the visualization of traffic. And then furthering the case that this was something weird. Maybe 80% of this traffic had a brand new Chrome user agent, and the remaining 20%-ish had a slightly older Chrome one. Requests were majorly hitting either Flash API/login or that 200 yielding endpoint. It looked like there's actually some clicking through our landing page to the sign-in prompt before blasting the traffic, but Flash API/login and that other endpoint is just how the vast majority of it fell. But interestingly, I guess up to that point, the login requests, if you were to just focus on those, had about a 5 times higher success rate than other attackers we'd seen up till then. This is still nowhere close to normal, but it was something I'd have to explain to my team for everyone to feel comfortable blocking. There are various services out there like Have I Been Pwned or Hack Notice that you can use to spot check emails or usernames versus big past breaches. So kind of going that route, I found all these successful logins had one particular breach in common, and it was a breach that included pretty crackable password hashes, MD5. So that basically made for a full picture. A couple hosting providers probably driving headless Chrome with a script. Puppeteer or Playwright would pull down a Chrome binary and then not keep it updated. That kind of explained the user agent versions. And then the success rate came out of having a good credential list to stuff with, seemingly one that hadn't been used thus far. So there was just a lot of stuff like that going on during launch. Our aim overall was to minimize negative customer experience. And that was contained to maybe folks who'd been breached before and then reused passwords. Nowadays, hypothetically, if you could get through to Credential stuff, good luck finding a list that'll bear any fruit. We haven't seen Credential stuffing success anywhere near what some people might have had at launch in a good while. And it just seems like the reason for that is eventually everyone out there runs the big lists on you, maybe super slowly, but unless some big new breach occurs with truly fresh credentials, it's all been tried and then reset in some manner or other. Because it's not hard to detect a compromised account. It's actually much easier than seeing someone attack in a lot of ways. And then you just force a new password at next login. So, reading between the lines, at this point, you can probably guess about what it takes to write your own automation and run it well. It's really easy now to drive a headless browser via script, and especially if you don't mind writing some server-side JavaScript, you can choose between Puppeteer or Playwright. And I'd actually recommend the latter because A, it's newer, and B, it opens up the possibility of driving some non-Chrome browsers. Because Puppeteer has allowed great, easy driving of headless Chromium for a while, and it seems to be the most popular choice for malicious automation. Thus, if you drive headless Firefox, that's different, and that just switches things up and not as obvious. Then the logic of your program, obviously going to depend a lot on what your target is, but remember to try and look like a normal user, and keep in mind error rate visualization. A lot of times, I guess, if you're credential stuffing, you can't do anything about visualization that's endpoint specific, but you can imagine, as we've sort of discussed, these host-wide or service-wide scenarios. That just visualizing error rates, that's one of the easiest ways for your target to notice something's going on. And also keep in mind that they probably visualize overall request levels. And traffic tends to fall out in that normal wave-like pattern over a long period of time. So if, say, 4 a.m. is the slowest time of day for your target, and that's when you decide to hammer them with traffic, you're going to get noticed. Then, where do you send your traffic from? Even a one-man security team running an open source WAF by themselves can do all sorts of network blocks real easy. So go searching for a list of bad ASNs, and then get a bunch of hosts that don't appear there. Search their IP addresses too. There's all sorts of services like Scamalytics, which maintain reputation scores for ASNs and for individual IPs. And the more you can spread your traffic out, generally, the better. But don't take it to the extreme that each IP no longer looks, or reads rather, like a single typical user. And that's my talk. Thank you for listening. Again, this is live at 9 a.m. Eastern on a Sunday towards the end of Hope, so much appreciation. Also, just wanted to quickly thank my team, the DTC security team, especially Jay Ball and Brian Lozada. And we are hiring, so feel free to come find me here on the Hope channels or through like LinkedIn or whatever. We're growing for AppSec, but also cloud security and teaming. We have a lot going on besides just fighting bots, as described here too.
Thank you, Randy, for your presentation. This is the part where we have interaction with our audience with question and answers. We have some questions from the audience. Let me read out the first one to you. Please summarize your tool set for traffic analysis.
Sure. So I can't go into too much detail on that, but I feel like we spend our most time looking at a couple of WAFs that basically show us all the sort of WAF discernible details coming in at the perimeter. We also spend a lot of time doing more analysis with sort of a log ingestion tool. So if we're really sort of doing a more advanced investigation, we'll go into the and kind of look into more details of what user identifiers might be linked to certain requests and then what ties them together.
All right. There's another one. Can you describe your interaction with HBO concerning your work?
Sure. So I guess that's kind of a general question. I feel like HBO makes up the heart of our content, and we're kind of in this process of switching from like my official employer being HBO to just that being Warner Media, and Warner Media being this one big thing. But I feel like the HBO content is one of the things that attracted me to the company. You might see I have this Sopranos sweatshirt on, but yeah. So I feel like people are still very attracted to the HBO content, and it gives me some cool pictures to put in my slideshows.
All right. There's another question. Did you do most of this work alone, or did you work with a colleague or a team of people? And did you use a revision system to keep a track of all your tools?
Yeah, so it's kind of a combination of solo work and working as a team. I feel like a lot of times you'll kind of get into this flow state with investigations solo, and then you'll take a bunch of findings and share them with the team, and sort of get peer review and feedback. As for like the state of our tools, we've kind of gotten better at revision tracking over time to where like we can hit the API for a bunch of tools, and periodically we have like a Git repo that tracks changes. We auto generate a change log based on whatever was changed in the last config version. So we're getting better with that, and I think that's a strong thing you need to keep track of, especially when you're changing tools really quickly to try to respond to attacks.
All right, there's another one. When you see an attack come from a particular IP, if you block the IP, then the attacker just cycles to another IP. What if instead of blocking, you just started sending a canned static stub response? This doesn't trip your typical script because it's still seeing a response. Would that work?
Yeah. So that's something that we've kind of done. It You see a variety of, I guess, logic in the way people have scripted, I guess, these things that are attacking us. But sometimes you'll see like if we just send back a blank 403, or I guess kind of pick your responsive choice. There are certain tools that even it seems like after you've blocked them, they don't realize they're being blocked. I guess if your logic, say you're sending back a blank 403 and the script is assuming that maybe any 400 status response means that the credentials were bad, it'll just keep hitting you and driving up the cloud bill for this attacker. So definitely, I feel like, especially if you're like running your own WAF and protecting your own form or some smaller site, you can play around with like these stub responses and see how that affects who's coming in to hit you. Because definitely there's a variety of ways you can respond, and some are more effective than others.
There's another one. What advice do you have for Hope attendees who might face similar issues in their workplace? How to get support and buy-in from management, colleagues, etc.?
Yeah, so I feel like I kind of mentioned this a little bit in my talk, but a big part of, I guess, our flow in responding to these things has been like really justifying why you're putting in certain blocks before we do them. There's a lot of sensitivity to blocking legitimate people that are coming to our experience, so certainly we don't want to do that. So we spend a great deal of time reporting, one, why certain threads that we'd block on would effectively block an attacker, but also that they wouldn't block someone else. And I think over time you get better at trying to communicate that to the wider team, not just like, oh, we should block these things because we've seen this malicious traffic, but just really detailing, why this is a continued attacker. Maybe these sources have proven to be attacking you regularly, and then that it won't impact legitimate users. So I see that as probably like half of what I do around this stuff is just really communicating that effectively. And I think owning those skills as much as just finding and blocking things is valuable and advice that I'd offer.
Okay. You mentioned that you are hiring. Could you give us some details on where the jobs are being posted or how do we apply for?
Yeah, so I feel like this can be a little confusing. The HBO Max jobs are actually pointed on like our Warner Media hiring site. So if you go and you start searching around for like Warner Media jobs, I feel like you'll find the job postings, and a lot of them end in like -HBO Max. I know that I think right now we're looking for someone to sort of lead up an internal red team or a pretty senior person on that, and also another cloud security engineer. But certainly through the end of this year, I think we're considering to continue hiring for all of our sort of internal security-based roles. But certainly feel free to find me on LinkedIn, or Brian Lozada is kind of our CISO, and he's really cheerleading this hiring stuff. So feel free to find him on LinkedIn too.
We have one last question. I would request you keep it very short because we are running out of time. You mentioned sensitivity to false positives. Do end users complain come in? Or how do you develop confidence that your users are not locking out of your customers?
Yeah, so on this one, I think it kind of depends on the culture around your blocking. We found, especially, we've gotten better at this over time. Whenever we're putting in new blocks of any sort, we communicate pretty widely to the other teams that might be impacted. And especially, like, we have a whole Slack channel on our customer experience support team who are interacting directly with customers, whether that's over live chat or phone or any of those forums. So we make sure to let them know that we're instituting new blocks, and that hopefully we're not going to block any legit users, but some signs that a legitimate user is being blocked. So that's kind of our approach to that, is just really socializing that we're doing blocks, especially to the folks that are talking directly to customers.
All right, Randy, thank you so much for that insightful presentation and interacting with our audience. For a quick announcement for all our audience who are watching Hope 2020, we have a lightning talk starting at 1500 hours EDT today. Please join in. Thank you so much, and we'll be back with the next talk in the next 10 minutes.